Hello, this is Dr. Christian Lehman, and this is Reading the Victorian Novel. Today, we will be talking about part 16 of David Copperfield, chapters 47 to 50. In this installment, some of what I will be talking about are the chapter titles and two dominant metaphors, prisons and disease. As a content warning, I also will be discussing female suicide, and I'll look at a phrase to form a mind about Dora. I'll also be looking at the miscarriage that happens in this installment, at dashes, at David's passivity and Rosa's attack, and we'll end with the illustrations. The chapter titles in this installment are Martha, where David and Peggotty continue following Martha and learn more of her story. Domestic, which is about David and Dora. I am involved in a mystery, which will keep a mystery, and Mr. Peggotty's dream comes true, where we end the Emily Steerforth plot by returning Emily to London and to Mr. Peggotty. So one of the things that happens right away at the start of this installment is the idea of prisons, and it's introduced with a reference to Millbank. She is Martha. She proceeded so quickly when she got free of the two currents of passengers setting towards and from the bridge that between this and the advance she had of us when she struck off, we were in the narrow waterside street by Millbank before we came up with her. Millbank is a reference to an area that is now the Tate Modern, which was the site of the first modern prison. When I use the phrase modern prison, what I mean is a scientific prison. It's not just a castle or a house. It is specifically designed to be a prison along kind of a panoptic line. So here from a map of 1867 is an image of that prison. So that was run from 1860 to 1890. That date must be wrong. It had lots of disease outbreaks, cholera and dysentery. And starting in 1843, it was used as a holding area for convicts before transportation. This is key because in a little bit, we will actually have people start moving towards Australia, both as immigrants and as convicts transported. Here's three examples of the disease language in this installment. This part is about Millbank. There was a story that one of the pits dug for the dead in the time of the Great Plague was hereabout, and a blighting influence seemed to have proceeded from it over the whole place. This idea of the blighting influence coming from a previous disease and out of the earth into the air is part of a theory called miasma, which I'll say more about later. Then in domestic, the fact is, my dear, I began, there is contagion in us. We infect everyone about us. I might have gone on in this figurative manner if Dora's face had not admonished me that she was wondering with all her might whether I was going to propose any new kind of vaccination or other medical remedy for this unwholesome state of ours. So here we have kind of modern medicine of an infection and contagion and a solution via vaccination. And then this part is Rosa talking to Emily. I am of a strange nature, perhaps, Rosa Dartle went on, but I can't breathe freely in the air you breathe. I find it sickly. Therefore, I will have it cleared. I will have it purified of you. So here, the theory of disease in the air. So this connects to an idea of 19th century health reform. In 1798, we had the first smallpox vaccine. Vaccine comes from waka, meaning cow, and the way the first vaccine came about was scraping a cowhide. 1840 was the first British Vaccination Act. The response was similar to what we've seen every time there's a vaccination encouragement of many people opposing it, saying it violated their rights. 1853, the Second Vaccination Act was compulsory for children under 3, again, responded to with outcry. 1867, the Third Vaccination Act, compulsory for children under 14. So you'll remember Copperfield is 1849, 1850, so fits right in between these two acts. A couple of other elements that are going on. Between 1840 and 1860, there were severe cholera outbreaks in London and globally. Shortly after, 3 years after Copperfield, there was the Broad Street outbreak. And this is where we get the important difference between Jon Snow's germ theory and miasma. So in a great book called The Ghost Map, it lays this out. It's also otherwise well known, but the dominant thought was the miasma theory, where cholera is spread through the air. John Snow, looking at various things, was like, no, it must be spread through the water, and that's the germs, and he was actually able to trace it to a specific pump handle on Broad Street. And then in 1897, the vaccine for cholera was discovered. So that's our one metaphor of disease. The other dominant metaphor in this section is prison language, which also comes from the first mention of Millbank. And so here is about Millbank. There were neither wharves nor houses on the melancholy waste of road near the great blank prison. Rank weeds straggled over all the marshy land in the vicinity. So the great blank prison is the Millbank. And the reason I've highlighted marshy is because another very famous prison is the Marshalsea. It comes to prominence in Dickens's novel, Little Dorrit. Then we have the servant of the Copperfields who is taken up. He was taken to Bow Street. The surprise and its consequences would have been much less disagreeable to me if he had not been penitent, but he was very penitent indeed, and in a peculiar way, not in the lump, but by installments. So here, the Bow Street runners, some of you might have heard of from Sherlock Holmes, and the phrase penitent, meaning like a penitentiary, a place that you're put in order to feel bad about your crimes, to be penitent for them, another reference to a holding. When discussing the miscarriage, Copperfield uses very strange language of prisons. The spirit fluttered for a moment on the threshold of its little prison, and unconscious of captivity, took wing. Then in the letter from Micawber to Copperfield, he says, my feet will naturally tend towards the King's Bench prison, which is where Micawber had earlier been held. And then when they actually meet up, I was about to observe that I again behold the serene spot where some of the happiest hours of my existence fleeted by. This is Micawber speaking. And notice he says, fleeted by. The Fleet is another famous prison. Here on this map from the Charles Dickens page, we can see there's the Fleet, the Marshalsea, there's King's Bench, and there's Millbank. So you see there's kind of a circle of prisons. It's a very kind of prison-heavy city at this period of the 19th century. When we see Martha, she's about to potentially commit suicide, to die by suicide. This is Copperfield. I think she was talking to herself. I am sure, although absorbed in gazing at the water, that her shawl was off her shoulders and that she was muffling her hands in it. In an unsettled and bewildered way, more like the action of a sleepwalker than a waking person. I know and never can forget that there was that in her wild manner which gave me no assurance but that she would sink before my eyes until I had her arm within my grasp. So Copperfield imagining that she's about to throw herself into the river. This was a relatively common way in which people died by suicide. She says, then we have another reference. This time it's Rosa Dartle talking to Emily. Hide yourself, she pursued, if not at home somewhere. Let it be somewhere beyond reach, in some obscure life, or better still, in some obscure death. I wonder, if your loving heart will not break, you have found no way of helping it to be still. I have heard of such means sometimes. I believe they may be easily found. So here we have Rosa kind of encouraging Emily toward death by suicide. Where I want to focus now is on this really intense exchange around the idea of forming Dora's mind. And this is a lot of text, I know. I'll try to unpack it as we go. And this is David working through this here. What other course was left to take? To form her mind. This was a common phrase of words which had a fair and promising sound, and I resolved to form Dora's mind. I began immediately. When Dora was very childish, and I would have infinitely preferred to humor her, I tried to be grave, and disconcerted her and myself too. I accustomed myself to giving her, as it were quite casually, little scraps of useful information or sound opinion, and she started from them when I let them off, as if they had been crackers. No matter how incidentally or naturally I endeavored to form my little wife's mind, I could not help seeing that she always had an instinctive perception of what I was about, and became a prey to the keenest apprehensions. The formation went on very slowly. I pressed Traddles into the service without his knowledge, and whenever he came to see us, exploded my mines upon him for the edification of Dora at second hand. The amount of practical wisdom I bestowed upon Traddles in this manner was immense and of the best quality, but it had no other effect upon Dora than to depress her spirits and make her always nervous, with the dread that it would be her turn next. I found myself in the condition of a schoolmaster, a trap, a pitfall, of always playing spider to Dora's fly, and always pouncing out of my hole to her infinite disturbance. Still, looking forward through this intermediate stage to the time when there should be a perfect sympathy between Dora and me, and when I should have, quote, formed her mind, and, quote, to my entire satisfaction, I persevered, even for months, finding at last, however, that although I had been all this time a very porcupine or hedgehog bristling all over with determination, I had effected nothing. It began to occur to me that perhaps Dora's mind was already formed. So here we have this big movement of David becoming like Murdstone, right? This idea of trapping her, being a schoolmaster, and David's experience with schoolmasters is that they do trap. This idea that she's afraid it's going to be her turn next, much like with David having to recite things for Murdstone. And all in all, right, the difference between form and firm is just one vowel. A couple of other things. Dora actually is smart, right? She has an instinctive perception. Meanwhile, Traddles, this happens to without his knowledge, and it's rather an abuse of friendship that we see happening here. And so all in all, it definitely is a passage of David's insecurity, of David being like Murdstone, but also a moment of quiet resistance on Dora's part. So notice how David uses this language of crackers, that is not the saltine, but rather small explosions, and then very mines themselves, right? Large explosions that are actually exploding. Technology that we have here against the oxymoronically for edification. Edification means to build something up. So David's very attempt to do this is actually undercut by the way in which he attempts it, as we've been pointing out for the last several weeks. In this passage, Dora suffers a miscarriage. But as that year wore on, Dora was not strong. I had hoped that lighter hands than mine would help to mold her character, and that a baby smile upon her breast might change my child wife to a woman. It was not to be. The spirit fluttered for a moment on the threshold of its little prison, and unconscious of captivity, took wing. When I can run about again, as I used to do, Aunt, said Dora, I shall make Jip race. He is getting quite slow and lazy. I suspect, my dear, said my aunt, quietly working by her side, he has a worse disorder than that. Age, Dora. Do you think he is old? Said Dora, astonished. Oh, how strange it seems that Jip should be old. It's a complaint we are all liable to, little one, as we get on in life, said my aunt cheerfully. I don't feel more free from it than I used to be, I assure you. But Jip, said Dora, looking at him with compassion, even little Jip, oh, poor fellow. So here we have this idea of the prison of the womb, right? Even kind of misogyny in that language. This idea of being trapped in a female body, being one of imprisonment, age itself being a natural kind of prison that you don't get free from. And then just noticing how David is constantly looking to other people and himself to make things the way he wants them to be, rather than accepting the way things are, not taking responsibility for that choice, but constantly trying to change things, whether it's passively or indirectly. I'm not going to read the whole part of this passage. This is Micawber's rising anger against Heap. I just want to point out a couple of things. David says, I never saw a man so hot in my life. He got hotter and hotter. And then, I'll put my hand in no man's hand, said Mr. Micawber, gasping, puffing, and sobbing to that degree that he was like a man fighting with cold water. So we have the combination of heat and cold water, which of course produces steam. And one of the things that Micawber says is he's going to be kind of a Vesuvius, a natural element. So we have some really interesting ideas here of David using his technological explosions versus Micawber's kind of natural ones, which are also historical, of course, with Mount Vesuvius being the mountain that erupted and covered Pompeii. Dickens also can't resist a punctuation joke because he says later on that in the midst of this speech, whenever the name Heap came up, Micawber would frequently dash at it. And of course, you can see in this page quite easily all of the dashes. This passage is going to be about class. This is Martha's dwelling. It was a broad paneled staircase with massive balustrades of some dark wood, cornices above the doors ornamented with carved fruit and flowers, and broad seats in the windows. But all these tokens of past grandeur were miserably decayed and dirty. Rot, damp, and age had weakened the flooring, which in many places was unsound and even unsafe. Some attempt had been made, I noticed, to infuse new blood into this dwindling frame by repairing the costly old woodwork here and there with common deal. But it was like the marriage of a reduced old noble to a plebeian pauper, and each party to the ill-assorted union shrunk away from the other. So here, David's making a comment on interclass marriage, right? The reduced old noble is poor, and a pauper is poor, but the noble is noble, come from a higher class, and that's different from being a plebeian, from a low class. Notice David also uses chiasmus, an ABBA, interconnected, interlocked structure. So reduced and pauper, noble and plebeian, drawing a lot of attention to this incongruity. Here's a little bit on David's passivity when he overhears Rosa's attack on Emily. "Stay there," she said, "or I'll proclaim you to the house and the whole street. If you try to evade me, I'll stop you. If it's by the hair and raise the very stones against you." A frightened murmur was the only reply that reached my ears. A silence succeeded. I did not know what to do. Much as I desired to put an end to the interview, I felt that I had no right to present myself, that it was for Mr. Peggotty alone to see her and recover her. Would he never come? I thought impatiently. So here, right, David's very clear inability to act. He could easily intercede, but he thinks other people have a role. It's in fact quite theatrical, quite melodramatic. He's like, where is Peggotty? He's late for his cue. One of the things that Emily appeals to with Rosa to try to stop her attack is female solidarity that Rosa will deny. "If I would be spared," returned the other fiercely, "what is there in common between us, do you think?" "Nothing but our sex," said Emily with a burst of tears. "And that," said Rosa Dartle, "is so strong a claim, preferred by one so infamous, that if I had any feeling in my breast but scorn and abhorrence of you, it would freeze it up. Our sex, you are an honor to our sex." "I have deserved this," said Emily, "but it's dreadful. Dear, dear lady, think what I have suffered and how I am fallen. Oh, Martha, come back. Oh, home, home." So here we see, right, Rosa is dead set against Emily despite their shared sex. Emily acknowledges her status as a fallen woman in Rosa's eyes, but still can't understand at any point why Rosa hates her so much. Emily does not know who Rosa is. But she does finally call out Steerforth for what he has done, which is criminal seduction. "No, no," cried Emily, clasping her hands together. "When he first came into my way, that the day had never dawned upon me, and he had met me being carried to my grave. I had been brought up as virtuous as you or any lady, and was going to be the wife of as good a man as you or any lady in the world can ever marry. If you live in his home and know him, you know perhaps what his power with a weak, vain girl might be. I don't defend myself, but I know well, and he knows well, or he will know when he comes to die, and his mind is troubled with it, that he used all his power to deceive me, and that I believed him, trusted him, and loved him." Notice that repetition of the him on each of these, right? You could just say, "I believed, trusted, and loved him," but we hit that accusation, the acknowledgement that Emily knows it's not fully her fault. A couple of callbacks. I'm not going to read these full slides, but back in chapter 32, when Rosa first railed against Emily, she said, "I detest her if I could ever reproach her." And we see both of those words come up again in this exchange in chapter 50. All right, to the illustrations. So the river is a very famous illustration because in it, Fizz practices and kind of perfects what is called the dark plate. It's a new method of inscribing the steel with which to make the plate that gives you a really strong chiaroscuro, a contrast between light and dark. So here, the only light, right, is the dress of Martha's dress and Martha's face and neck. Everything else is various kinds of shadow. So if we start on the corner, we have a lot of kind of symbolic instances. Here we have an anchor that is fallen onto the shore, right? Kind of a lack of stability that we have there. We have a millstone, the idea of being kind of ground under a millstone. We have this barrel. We have the worst looking David Copperfield we've had yet. We have Mr. Peggotty, also not looking very Peggotty-ish. On the other side, in the background, we have St. Paul's Cathedral next to smokestacks. And I think this is a really important element because we have capitalism and the church. And it's the combination of these things that leads to a fallen woman status, right? The need to work, but also being cursed by a church saying that you are fallen at that point. With Emily, we also have the contrast of light and dark, right? What society sees in her is this outside, kind of the darkness, but hidden underneath, we see the lightness, right? Kind of interior versus exterior personality versus what society judges you for. And then we have this quite melodramatic panel where David is here, also not a very good David. There's his top hat on the table. Peggotty holds Emily. Emily's face is turned away. And then there's quite a few symbolic elements because we're going to contrast, in one panel, we're going to fuse Emily's past and present. And we're going to combine the Steerforthian moments and her past Yarmouthian moments. So down here on the lower left-hand side, we have a bunch of seashells. On contrast, over here, we have an invitation to a masked ball, a mask, some playing cards, and a slipper, right? So these are not things necessarily that we should think she has carried with her, although perhaps she has, but rather they are visual reminders of who she is, and they kind of triangulate and frame her on either side. Above, we have this picture of the boats and kind of walking, and so two instances of Emily's past. We, of course, have birds because we always need some bird cages. A cracked mirror that Emily seems to be looking into, symbolic perhaps of the way in which society sees her and she sees herself. In fact, the way that she's kind of turned, her face is going towards it. Her hair is fallen out, right? So it's loose, but Peggotty still is holding her up. So there's any number of elements that are kind of about past and present combining and uniting. Note that in these two images, we have a female figure and David and Peggotty. And in both of them, David is the one that is constantly pulled back, not engaged. A quick note. So we can actually see something pretty neat. We can see the draft, the sketch for what became the plate. And here, what you can notice is David did have his hat on in the original sketch, but also there was this other figure here. So people will point to and say this is perhaps Rosa. There is a moment in the text where Rosa does sit down, but I think with the head down, what we might actually see here is Fizz having drawn an idea of, do we want to show Rosa in this position or in this position? That's just an idea because I can't really justify this being Rosa outside of a very strange reading of the text. And with that, we look forward to installment 17.